Conversations on race and policing began in response to the police killing of George Floyd on May 25, 2020. In this partnership between CSU San Bernardino and the Brennan Center for Justice, we hope to engage in ongoing discussions related to the history and current context of race, policing, and criminal justice with guests from diverse academic fields and backgrounds.
Good morning. Welcome to a conversation on race and policing. The organizers are Mary Texera, Professor Emeritus Sociology at UCSB, Michael German, former FBI agent, Matt Patino, Professor of Grafton Hills College, Amber Broden, CSUSB grad and Professor at California State Dominguez Hills, Robbie Madrigal, CSUSB Public Affairs, Jeremy Murray, Professor, CSUSB History Department, and our technical support, Thin Lay. Jeremy will do the land acknowledgement. Thank you, Jeremy.
Thanks, Stan. California State University San Bernardino acknowledges that the land on which our San Bernardino facility is sited is the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mariam, commonly referred to as the Serrano people, which in the contemporary era are represented by two federally recognized Indian tribes, the Yuhaviatam of San Manuel Nation and the Morongo Band of Mission Indians. Our histories and stories are intertwined in this space, and by sharing them in culturally appropriate ways, we honor and celebrate our indigenous neighbors and partners. Since 1965, CSUSB's development has benefited and will continue to benefit from this land's location and resources, and we recognize this. Along with this land acknowledgement, this university affirms tribal sovereignty and our responsibility to work with these tribes to further mutual respect and gratitude for all those involved. And I'll pass it to Mike German.
You're muted, Mike.
Thank you. Sorry about that. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Brianna Nofil to the program. Dr. Nofil is the assistant professor in the Department of History at William & Mary. Her recent book, The Migrant's Jail, An American History of Mass Incarceration, demonstrates how a century of political, economic, and ideological exchange between the immigration bureaucracy and the criminal justice system gave rise to the United States' vast immigration detention system, and how the federal government relied on sheriffs, police, local governments to make mass deportations possible. The book has won numerous accolades, including the Frederick Jackson Turner Award and the Ellis Hawley Prize from the Organization of American Historians. Dr. Nofil's work was featured prominently on a recent installment of NPR's Throughline, the Business of Migrant Detention, which connected her historical analysis with current events. Dr. Nofil, welcome to the program, and please tell us about your work.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so thrilled to be in what I feel like has really become kind of a storied venue for scholars of policing and incarceration to talk about our work. So I'm so happy to be here with you all today. So I am going to talk a little bit about the big ideas from this project, and I'm going to show you a few pictures because historians love talking about our source material. So hopefully you can see a little of that too. Okay, so I'm going to open today with this letter that is from almost exactly 100 years ago. It's from August 1925. And it's a letter from the Galveston League of Women Voters to their senator to express concern for what they call the dreadful conditions which exist in regard to the detention of deportees in this part of the world. So the women are referring to the Galveston County Jail, a local lockup that received federal money for each migrant they incarcerated in its squalid facilities. So the Galveston sheriff worked closely with the Immigration Service, detaining not only Mexican migrants, but growing populations of migrants from Europe. And similar arrangements to this one were taking root all throughout the United States in the 1920s. The federal government had a slate of new immigration laws, and it had very, very little detention space of its own. Therefore, it relied on contracts with localities to detain migrants in deportation or exclusion proceedings. So in some American communities, these arrangements were tremendously popular and they were tremendously profitable. But in other cases, they sparked broader conversations about policing and punishment. So, what did it mean for the county to incarcerate deportees, who, in the words of the League of Women Voters, quote, have broken some law of this country, but are not in the true sense of the word criminals? So this is a tension at the heart of immigration detention's long and horrifying history, a system I examine from the end of the 19th century all the way through to the present, in my first book, The Migrant's Jail: An American History of Mass Incarceration. So I ask how the story of detention changes if we look to spaces like this one that so distressed the League of Women Voters. Jails at the margins of the nation, sites that are not explicitly marked as sites of immigration detention, yet are absolutely doing that work. And at spaces where the federal government is paying localities a nightly rate for each migrant they detain. Money that at the beginning of the 20th century is frequently just pocketed by the sheriff, but by the end of the 20th century is reinvested into building bigger prisons, bigger jails, and bigger police forces. So I finished writing this book in the waning days of the Biden administration. So at the time it went to press, the data that I had was from 1947 to 2022. And this chart shows us the average number of people who are in immigration custody per night. So this practice doesn't begin in 1947, but this is when the federal government starts reporting it. So you can see here, right, there's sort of this massive late 20th century upward shift, and then you see this plummet, right? So this plummet is COVID. This is decarceration efforts that reflect decarceration efforts more broadly during COVID. But when I was first talking about this book, I would say, you can kind of see, it's starting to tick back up in 2022. Like there's probably, fairly good reason to believe that will continue to grow. Now in 2025, just a couple of weeks ago, for the first time, clearly in history, the US has eclipsed 60,000 people in immigration custody per night. So if I could take this chart for you all to 2025, we would be off the chart that I printed in my book. Okay, so as you all are aware, I'm sure, what these Galveston women encountered in 1925 continues to play out throughout the United States today. Migration control is a project that relies on local carceral space, local police power, and local community support. And it is a project that continues to make a lot of people a pretty shocking amount of money. So the work my book does is that it tries to offer an examination of how the Immigration Service builds these relationships, particularly with small towns throughout the US whose jails it is absolutely reliant on. So I show that even as the federal government built new migrant detention facilities of its own, even as it secured private contractors as partners, that county jails continued to serve an essential function. Any perceived crisis, whether it was a scandal about conditions or a natural disaster or an uprising or hunger strike among incarcerated migrants, could be remedied in the eyes of the government by moving migrants into these decentralized and nearly invisible outposts. So it has created a system of incarceration that is virtually impossible to get a comprehensive view of. And it shows, I believe, that mass deportations were and continue to be extraordinarily difficult without the collaboration of local governments. Okay, so I'm going to show you just a few sources quickly to give you a sense of some of the various episodes I look at throughout this work. So I start the book and my history of migrant incarceration on the northern border. And in particular, I open with this jail logbook from Essex County, which you can see here. So this jail logbook is a really remarkable source. We can talk more about this, but one of the real challenges of writing about migrant incarceration and writing history of jails is the sources are, if not actively purged and censored, just often not retained. So this depicts over 700 individual sort of entries and photographs of Chinese migrants who are detained in these incredibly rural jails of northern New York. And why I start here and why I think this is a really interesting and pivotal episode is that we start to see, even in these communities in the 1890s and 1900s, that communities want migrant detainees in their jails because it is this rare opportunity for them to get federal money. So we see this kind of revenue incentive from the earliest incarnations of this project. I also note, if you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, that person looks really young, right? That's a child. So we also see from these logbooks that from the earliest incarnations, children are caught in these systems. By the mid-century, the government is continuing to use jails. Much of its focus has shifted to the deportation of Mexicans along the US-Mexico border. But they're also starting to experiment with building detention camps, which they see as perhaps a replacement. One of the notable things about McAllen Detention Camp, which is pictured here in 1954, is that many of these barracks that you see depicted, these are the exact same barracks that were used for Japanese and Japanese American wartime incarceration. So the government literally picked up these barracks, carried them across Texas, and basically repurposed them for this new project of deportation and racial control. And you can also see here this quote from South Texas congressman that I always think is so prescient. And he's anxious because one of his concerns is that communities are going to lose money from holding migrants in their jail because the government is talking about building these new camps. And he says here, right, how were we supposed to know when we were building these big jails that the Immigration Service would decide to go into the prison business on a grandiose scale? And that, of course, I think feels really resonant for what we see today. And then the last source I want to show you comes from an Afro-Cuban asylum seeker in the 1990s in my home state of Florida. And this is one of many Cubans and Haitians who is being held in county jails throughout the Gulf South in this sort of moment of unprecedented and resurgent migrant detention. And so what you see here is part of a really rich archive of migrant protest and resistance, much of which has been retained by their lawyers. And so this was attached to an affidavit that this asylum seeker sent to his attorney. And what he's describing here is he's describing the use of electrical weapons in the jails. So he's saying that the jail officials in Jackson County are basically threatening migrants who are protesting, who are staging hunger strikes with these electrified shields. Okay, and this is the diagram he draws. And so the DOJ ends up investigating this, and they largely confirm the story that the migrants are telling. They say, yeah, electric weapons are being overused in this facility, is their quote. But they also say, in immigration detention facilities, right? In detention facilities run by the federal government, these weapons are banned. But in county jails in Florida, they're totally legal. So we see that people who are held in these different carceral spaces face different forms of violence and also face, I think, really different obstacles in filing grievances, getting accountability when they are in this sort of vast decentralized system. Okay, So the main takeaway of my book, of my research, is that local politics have an incredibly significant impact in immigration law enforcement. And also, I think we cannot separate migrant incarceration from mass incarceration writ large. It is happening in the same places, it is driven by many of the same impulses, and they are cyclically fueling one another. So the Immigration Service, both historically and today, has insulated itself from accountability through a nesting doll of contracts, subcontracts, arbitrary transfers, and dispersed facilities. It has made detention incredibly hard to challenge or even to see. And it is a system that has expanded incarceration, not just for non-citizens, but for citizens as well, fueled by racism, nativism, and the potential for financial profit. So I will end us there, but I'm very excited to be in discussion with you all and hear your questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Nofil. One of the things that's fascinating to me is, as you mentioned, this is not, the immigrants are not necessarily are not criminal in the sense that most people think of somebody committing a crime, and yet the conditions in immigration detention often don't have the same protections as the conditions that exist in criminal jails. Can you talk about that issue a little bit, and particularly going back to that the conditions that the Chinese immigrants were kept in the early part of the 19th or later part of the 19th century?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think your question speaks to sort of this larger tension that hangs over everything about immigration detention. And it's one of the questions that kind of motivated me, as someone who grew up next to a detention center, to kind of start investigating this in the first place, which is like, is this a prison, right? It looks like a prison, like the aesthetics resemble a prison. It is punitive, it is control oriented, and yet the courts say that this is a solely administrative process. And understanding that requires us to understand, I think, the moment of Chinese exclusion. This is a moment where Chinese migrants are bringing all of these cases to the courts to basically test the government's ability to do things like deport, exclude, right? Say that if you left the country and the law changed while you were out, you can't come back in, right? It's this moment where we're really trying to figure out what are the boundaries of federal power here. And so there is a case about deportation, and the government says that, or the courts say rather, that deportation is not punishment for a crime. It is just a means of returning someone to where they came from. Okay, and I always tell my students that's the kind of thing that the first time you hear it, you may say, oh, it sounds good, right? Like deportation shouldn't be punitive. We don't want it to be punishment. But in reality, what that means is it sets up this entire system of incarceration and policing on a totally different sort of legal foundation than we associate with the criminal legal system. So that means, right, that people who are in detention and deportation proceedings, many of whom are in the exact same physical shared spaces of American jails, do not have the right to a speedy trial. They do not have the right to a trial by a judge in the way we typically understand a judge. They don't have the right to a trial by jury. And most notably, and we know in terms of their outcomes, they do not have the right to an attorney. They have no right to legal representation. So it's kind of a paradox, right? It is a paradox of how you can have this system that in so many ways is indistinguishable from other forms of incarceration, yet without even the shadow of due process, right? That people in criminal legal proceedings certainly don't always get, but are constitutionally owed. So that is, I think, a question that we see over and over again. And it's a question, I think, for when the government is thinking about what immigration detention is going to look like, that is an open question. Like, is this going to look exactly like prisons or jails, or is it something different? Is it supposed to be gentler? What are we trying to convey by the way we incarcerate migrants in this country? And I think the answer changes over the 20th century.
So how long is the deportation process?
That's a great question. It really, really varies. And I think one of the the sort of like also things that can feel paradoxical is that some of the people who are detained the longest, they are detained the longest because they have lawyers. It is people who are, removed quickly, often that have no legal representation. So in my research, the longest cases of detention I've come across go to years. There's a really famous case where a woman is detained on Ellis Island for close to 3 years. It becomes a national controversy. But sort of a general case of deportation, it really varies. So something else that I think is notable is that in places like rural northern New York in the 1890s and the 1900s, those Chinese migrants are often held in those jails for, from what I gathered from that jail logbook, an average of about 5 months. So that is way, way longer than what detention looks like in a place like San Francisco at Angel Island, where detention is similarly like horrific and dehumanizing, but it is not. It is rarely 5 months long. So we also, I think, get a story about geography and about how where you enter, where you're apprehended, what court you end up in, also really, really shapes the length and yeah, duration of your experience.
Go ahead, Amber.
Hey, Brianna, I really appreciated your highlight of the daily detainment rate that we're seeing at 60,000 people. That was shocking to hear. And I think, too, what I was connecting with a lot as well was your description of how um, the detention centers in New York were formulated, especially during the era that you were mentioning. I think you said the 1700s, 1800s, around that time.
Yeah, turn of the 20th century, so like 1890s into the 1900s.
Yeah. And New York had one of the earliest prison systems that we utilize today, especially
Mhm.
with the difference between the congregate or the separate systems. And I was just wondering, how did you see that working? Because I do understand that I believe New York had the congregate where people were able to be together, but it was similar to what we're seeing in El Salvador, where they're housed in these huge facilities and unable to communicate with each other, and are dealing with abuse at various levels. Did
Mhm.
you see the similar kind of experience in your research too?
Yeah, thank you for that question. That is something that was that I also thought about when I was really surprised. I also assumed that immigration detention was going to sort of mostly be a story about the southern border, maybe also a story about the Caribbean and Florida. But I was very, very shocked to find out that sort of the earliest example where I could find where this was both actively litigated, but also sort of seen as this financial municipal mechanism was in northern New York of all places. But like you, I also thought, well, there is this sort of rich history of penal reform and this being kind of a hotbed of ideas about what the prison should look like. But one of the things that I think I guess what I would say is that a lot of that felt very absent. And I think what it reflects is that even in this moment, right, this sort of, going into the progressive era where there's all this energy that we could make the prison efficient, right? We could give it this reformist quality. People do not have that same attitude towards jails. And you see that over and over again, where there's always like one penologist who cares about jails, and he's always so beleaguered because he's like, no one thinks this is valid. No one cares, right? This is not, it is seen as a really different place, right? It's seen as short term. It's not seen as having the ability to fundamentally change people. And it's seen as this kind of like hodgepodge of an institution, right? That is holding people for different things. It is holding people for the federal government now, as well as the locality. And so even the reformers will just constantly sort of, people who are really hopeful about the potential of these other institutions, they have so little hope that the jail could be reformed. Like they're constantly just like, and the jail is, of course, like a hopeless institution. So I think like what that does is it gives these sheriffs tremendous power, right? Jails are not being regulated or overseen in the same way prisons are being in this era. So I think like it kind of leaves that, it cracks that door open for them to do something that many of them see as very entrepreneurial, right? Many of them say, the jail was this sort of, it was this thing that cost the county a lot of money to run. It constantly created problems. No taxpayers ever wanted to improve the jail. But now we have a way to turn our jail into something that is producing revenue for the community. And I think I just kind of think that the impact of that cannot be undersold. And I think that that is a calculus that we see sheriffs making very, very much today. And, definitely in rural places, but also nationwide.
So it's not beneficiary for the sheriff to deport anybody because
Yeah,
because the amount of money is coming in. But I had another part on that question, and that is some of the deportees don't want to be deported, period. And so that keeps them there longer because they, like you said, some get a lawyer, some stretch the process out, and yet the sheriff's continually bringing these funds in. Can you touch a little bit on that?
Yeah, that question is a question that the Immigration Service has as well, right? They say, we've decided to partner with these local sheriffs. We like a lot of things about doing detention in local jails, right? They really like that it gives them a footprint in basically every American community. Like pretty much every county has a jail. So it's really flexible, right? If migration routes shift from northern New York, you can easily call up the sheriff somewhere else. So they like that, but they are nervous about this like revenue incentive. They're really worried that there's corruption happening, right? That sheriffs are going to actively impede immigration law enforcement if they see these people, right, as as something that is making them money. If they see these incarcerations as, increasingly kind of a cornerstone of their local budget. And I think that is a question that goes throughout detention's entire history. It's a tension about, what are the dangers of creating financial incentives for localities to incarcerate? But yeah, I think that to your point about how people do not want to be deported, it runs the gamut. Some people, have such a miserable experience in the jail that they're like, please just like, however, like, let me out, even if it means deportation. But I would say the far more common experience is that people are actively trying to find ways to fight to stay in the United States, even as, right, for many of them, this is like, as you can imagine, a deeply disillusioning experience. About what the United States represents. So in that jail logbook, one of the other things that's really notable about it is that, this is after the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. The US has barred all Chinese laborers from the United States. It is this sort of like nakedly racist immigration law. So you kind of might expect that the US government was really effective in removing, deporting all of these people, but they're not. Like something like 90% of the people in that book are not actually removed or deported. They're released into the United States. So they suffer in these really long incarcerations, but it is kind of a means to an end. And it's because for at least this brief period, they have a legal strategy. The legal strategy is that they're going to claim to be US citizens. The US government has very little evidence to prove they're not US citizens. And so for this one brief historical moment, that is a very, and they're filing habeas corpus claims. So that's a really effective, the Immigration Service eventually kind of shuts this loophole, but for a little bit, it works, right? It is a sort of vast legal strategy that we see people in these jails collectively taking on. All the while, the sheriffs keep saying, these people, they don't even resist. They don't even protest, right? They're not staging uprisings, but they are resisting, right? They're clearly resisting. It's just not in the way that maybe their jailers expect to see.
Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, and kind of just pulling on that thread a little bit, I mean, one of the sort of arguments you hear a lot of people making is that, well, my family came over generations ago, but they went the legal way. But until the Chinese Exclusion Act, there really weren't laws, which is why it was difficult to prove somebody wasn't a citizen. It was because there really weren't laws about who came to the United States. And both the Chinese Exclusion Act and the Immigration Act of 1924 were both explicitly racist. And how much of that explicit racism in the law both damned the immigrants of that racial class into this horrible detention system, but also linger today in our immigration or through history
Mhm.
as the sort of undesirable alien moved from one group to another.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. So this is I think it's very interesting. So as you said, throughout basically up until 1924, the main immigration law in the books, right? The main task of immigration agents in this country is barring Chinese laborers. The door is, if not completely wide open, pretty much wide open for immigrants coming from Europe, right? There are very few. So I always tell my students, if your family, if people are telling you their family came the right way and their family came before like 1924 and they were from Europe, like there was really no wrong way. Like the door was open. Um, but right after 1924, things shift. Like now, for the first time, we have these laws that, explicitly cap migration from Europe for the first time. They particularly are targeting Southern Europeans and Eastern Europeans, right? So they reflect these new ideas of whiteness as not a monolith, but that there is maybe a hierarchy of whiteness, right? With sort of Western Europeans at the top and Italians and Jews at the bottom. So it also means, though, that the kind of the work of the immigration law enforcement officer is changing. Now they are going to be having, right, to police and adjudicate and potentially incarcerate European migrants as well. It means that European migrants can be illegal now. And so one of the things that I found really just remarkable was that we start to see by the 1920s European immigrants using this exact same migration route through northern New York, through Canada into northern New York, that Chinese migrants pioneered, right? So you start to see as the locus of racist law enforcement shifts, they are building off of these sort of strategies of entry and resistance that the groups before them pioneered. However, the story of detention really changes because now these sheriffs are being asked not just to detain Chinese migrants, right? They're being asked to detain all of these various people from Europe. And in particular, they're being asked to detain European women and children for the first time. And many of these sheriffs that were incredibly enthusiastic, right, about warehousing hundreds of Chinese migrants in these jails are going to start to have second thoughts about this. They're going to say, this felt like easy money a couple years ago. No one was asking humanitarian questions about the Chinese migrants. But now the local newspaper is like breathing down my neck and they're publishing all these articles about this like white mother and baby who are suffering in the jail. So I think it's not only, I think, questions of race in immigration law, but it's also, I think, questions about race and incarceration and who Americans imagine as belonging in a jail, right? And we see that European immigrants really test the boundaries of this. People do not feel comfortable with the idea of treating Europeans in this way. And so these are moments of real friction for the immigration detention system.
So, do you see the system building or setting up camps for Europeans? Separate
Mm,
camps, in other words, doing something special so they don't feel so bad about what they're doing to the other people.
yeah, that's a really interesting question. And that exact line of justification is used in the 1980s when all these lawsuits are showing that basically it's exclusively Haitian asylum seekers being detained. This is an explicit argument of the government as they say we have to start detaining other groups also so that it doesn't seem quite as targeted and quite as racist as if we are only detaining, the first really significant wave of Black asylum seekers. Yeah, so I would not say there's ever a moment where they are setting up camps for Europeans, but I think one example is Ellis Island in the 50s. So Ellis Island's sort of heyday in our national imagination, right, is the early 20th century. It is this moment where, again, the gate is pretty much open. Very, very few people, I think it's like less than 2% of people who arrive at Ellis Island at its peak are going to be excluded. So, however, but post World War II, like the narrative of Ellis Island, no one talks about Ellis Island post World War II because it's not a happy story. It's really a story about the government is obsessed with ideological dissidents, right? They're obsessed with possible fascist influence, possible communist influence. So they're looking at these people from Europe very differently. They now want to detain them. They now want to do extensive investigations into their background. And so it's not, entirely European, but it is predominantly European. And it is, the newspapers say like Ellis Island, once a gate of welcome, is now basically a prison. It is this holding space where people are being held for months and years. But again, I think the big difference, this is happening simultaneously to the creation of these camps on the southern border. The big difference is public attention. People, turn these white, ideologically, possibly, right, people who are being accused of being ideological dissidents, they get individualized. They get individual campaigns for their freedom. They get to be names. They get to have stories, right? They have networks often rallying behind them. Um, and they sort of, become public figures. It becomes really hard to justify why you are detaining this woman on Ellis Island for 3 years on the basis of secret evidence. So in the 50s, the government makes this really big pronouncement because there's so much controversy about these Ellis Island detentions, right? And people are also they're invoking language of concentration camps. They're saying like this is a concentration camp in the United States. It's Ellis Island. Um, but they are going to say that they are abolishing immigration detention. The Eisenhower administration will declare that it's abolishing immigration detention. And it's a really interesting moment because in some ways it feels, I think, hopeful if you're looking for examples of like places where incarceration is walked back or where people imagine other like possibilities. But on the other hand, like when they say they're abolishing detention, they really only mean for Europeans. They continue, right? This is the moment where detention is massively expanding on the southern border. Um, but they say, oh yeah, Mexicans aren't really the same, right? Those detentions are so quick. We can remove them so quickly. That's not the kind of detention people were really uncomfortable with. So yeah, I think it is really a story about like the work. The only real moments where we see detention significantly reimagined and reevaluated, I think, are moments when it is affecting white migrants.
Jeremy?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Nofil. And that reminded me a little bit of um, the difference in the sort of healthcare conversations that go on around OxyContin and that kind of, that the opiate the opioid epidemic, and suddenly they sound very very concerned about drug
Yeah.
abuse and drug overdose. And I think so much of this obviously can be explained, these sort of softening tones by white supremacy. But I wanted to do a quick point of order and then also ask Matt, one of our co-organizers is Matt Patino, who's in the he's in the, among the attendees and had a question. But before I do, I just want to quickly note that thanks to Brianna and thanks to Rebecca Lubas, Dean Lubas in the library, and Anika Anderson at Project Rebound, we have a really nice batch of Professor Nofil's book. So thanks to all of those in the chat. For those who would like a book, I don't think there's enough for everybody, but I'll put my email address in the chat, and you can email me there and share your location on campus or your home address, and I will send you a copy of the book. So thanks to Professor Nofil, thanks to Dean Lubas and Professor Anderson for providing those books. And from Matt, who I think is mobile, that's why he's in the attendees. In your research, did you see that the length of a person's detention was related to their economic value to the jail?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Um, I think that my perception is that the Immigration Service's concerns about jailers slowing the process are kind of exaggerated. I think that the system is working incredibly slowly for reasons that mostly don't have to do with the money that is being made. I think the money that is being made is incidental and desirable to localities, but this system is a mess for a million other reasons, right? To name a few. There's not enough there's never the immigration service, and I think this can be hard to like wrap your head around because it's so enormous today, right? And getting bigger probably by the minute. But the immigration service is a really small agency in the early 20, really for most of the 20th century. They are not like this bastion of funding. They are relatively few employees, right? And they are given what is, I think, a pretty extraordinary mandate, like keeping all Chinese migrants out of just thinking about the sheer size of the US's borders, right? Like it's a pretty impossible task they're given. So, I think that this, and you also think about what it looked like to try to win a court case or to even, come up with documentation to prove a person wasn't born here. Like often this involves, like the US has to talk to the embassy in China, right? This is like there's telegrams. Like when you sit with these files, you kind of just, I think, are like reminded of how much time is elapsing between like every piece of correspondence. And I think that's even more the case, right? When you are in one of these locations that is not the hub, right? And it's one thing when you're in New York City or San Francisco. It's another thing if you're like the one person who's detained in a jail in rural Ohio, right? They're just like kind of not getting to you for a while. So I don't think it's like typically a conspiracy where like the jailers are like, I'm gonna stop the immigration service at any cost. I think the system is just so remarkably slow and cumbersome to begin with that it produces a lot of potential for financial profit. The one other thing I'll say on this topic is that one place where I do think that tension really comes up is starting post World War I, but really, really peaking in the 80s and 90s. There is discussion about what is going to happen with people who cannot be deported. So post World War I, this is going to be people who, their country of origin has shifted borders and their new country doesn't acknowledge them as a citizen, right? So won't accept deportations. And this is, I think, a really important thing about deportation, right? Is it requires two countries to agree to it. You can't just deport people to a place that will not accept deportation. So it's a geopolitical negotiation. But in the 80s, when the US is detaining these really large numbers of Cuban refugees and asylum seekers, Castro is refusing any deportations. And so the US ends up with this group of people who they claim have committed a crime in the United States, so they can't be paroled, but they also there's no indication that Castro is ever going to start accepting deportees. So that makes the courts reckon with this question of, can you detain someone forever? Can it still be administrative if there is no indication that deportation is ever going to be possible? The courts say yes, but many sheriffs say, oh, well, this is the ideal group of people to detain, right? Like if you were looking for people who you might imagine as like a sustainable revenue source, a renewable revenue source, people who cannot be deported, right? I think pr have a particular financial promise to municipalities. And we see them making that point really explicitly that these are sort of the optimal detainees to have.
The history of why the people are here in the first place has always been the Chinese came to work on the railroad and such, and like you said, the borders are open. The Latinos came in to do farm work and so on and so on and so on, and some committed crimes, probably small amounts committed crimes, but when they started cleansing, they started incarcerating for deportation. Can you talk a little bit about the history of how these people got here in the first place?
Sure. It looks really different in all of these different moments. It's certainly a question that local law enforcement and just people in northern New York, right, are constantly asking. Because, I think in the same way we today think of this as like a very white place, not a place where we associate a lot of certainly migration from Asia. People are like, why are they, why is this happening? And it's because people are, they're looking for alternate paths of entry. People, I think, really quickly realize that, entering through New York and San Francisco, that is where the Immigration Service's power is limited, right? But that's where it's concentrated. So if you are looking for another route into the United States, right, these sort of really vast land borders where the immigration officials simply cannot be everywhere at once, are really promising. So people are coming in all different ways, but we also know that like these routes are being brokered. So there are like Chinese communities in Canada, right, where migrants would stop over before they would enter. We know that many of these sort of migration brokers were helping connect them with lawyers once they were in the jail to file these habeas corpus claims. So people, are not always acting as sort of individual, as people totally alone, like individuals in this world, right? We know that they are building on community knowledge. We know that in some cases they are explicitly using community money to fund these journeys. Yeah, people come in all different ways, but I think there's kind of there's some patterns.
Michael?
And sort of building on that, I liked the way that you said that the Immigration Service is given an impossible task, and whether part of the purpose of it being an impossible task is that there is a desire for an exploitable working class. And I think that shows up in the World War II program to bring labor into the United States from Central and South America, and through that program. But the immediate reversal of it once that labor is no longer deemed needed. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think it is one of the core questions here is, does the US actually ever want to enforce these laws it has on the books, right? Are these laws to send a message about who we are and who we are not, right? Are they to send a message about racial identity, about our political values, or are they actually to keep working class people out of the country? And I think that, something I always come back to in reading these immigration service records, because, every year they have to go to Congress and they have to argue that they should get more money, right? They have to argue for an increase in their budget. And throughout the 20th century, these increases are pretty marginal up until the Reagan administration. Again, no one is really putting a ton of money behind deportation, which is interesting in its own right, right? This is really not seen as a priority. And I think like there's the question of, right, is it because business doesn't want this, which I think is definitely part of it. These sort of nativist factions who want these restrictive laws are often not the same people who have a ton of power. Sometimes they are, but not always. Um, but there's also, I think, a tension with like they have to they have to argue for their own inefficiency, right, in order to justify these budget increases. Because like if they're doing great with the money they've got, then there's no reason Congress should double their budget. But they kind of have to go before Congress every year and be like, we're getting killed out there, right? Like we don't have enough money. People are flooding into the country. So they kind of need the crisis that they are not able to manage to sort of enable their own administrative power and expansion. An immigration service that accomplishes its job, right, I don't think is an immigration service that is able to continue arguing for money in this same way. So yeah, I never really know what to do with that, but it feels true.
One of the strongest unions in California are prison guards.
Mhm.
They make a tremendous amount of money. And when you were talking about the processes of the federal government paying, have you seen a lot of corruption?
Um, I think there are examples of staggering corruption. I will give you one. I guess what I would say is that the corruption does not always take the form you would expect. Like, I don't think it's usually like a matter of like the sheriff saying, I will give you this federal bureaucrat a certain amount of money if they send a certain number of immigrant detainees my way. I think like a lot of the corruption that I've seen is more subtle than that. So, for example, one of the cases I look at is Louisiana in the 80s and 90s, and I think a lot of folks today also have been thinking about Louisiana because so many of these really high-profile detention cases, particularly of student protesters, have involved taking people out of, Manhattan and moving them deep, deep, deep into the heart of Louisiana. So Louisiana is becomes sort of a boom town for immigration detention in the 80s and 90s, largely off the detention of Cubans who could not be deported. And many of these sheriffs, I look in particular at a parish called Avoyelles, and the sheriff whose name is Bill Belt, and he detains people. He's sheriff for 28 years, which is like a shockingly normal amount of time to be sheriff. Sheriffs are in office for just so long. Um, but, if people constantly, he builds 5 jails, basically. He detains more Cubans than anyone else in the country. And people in the local paper keep saying, he's not personally getting rich off of this. Like, he's bringing money into the community, but it's not like the early 20th century where the sheriff could just pocket the money, right? The money is going into the county. And so people say, okay, he's got political incentives, but why is he going to all of this trouble, right, to build this many immigration detention beds when it doesn't seem to be like personally financially enriching him? And then, close to the end of the time he's in office, the FBI indicts him on charges of corruption involving phone contracts in the jails. And this is the kind of thing where you're like, oh yeah, so it wasn't as simple, right, as it like the federal government was slipping him money or something like that. But he started a company that got controlled allegedly. I think he was not convicted on this, which is its own story. But yeah, he has the company that controls all of the jail phone contracts, and we can see that he sets up that company basically immediately after he gets his first immigration service contract. And so I think it's also a reminder, there's like money being made in so many ways here. Like the private prison companies get a lot of the grief and they deserve a lot of the grief, right? But that is like the tip of the iceberg of all of the industries and businesses that are profiting off of immigration detention and incarceration writ large.
Why is it necessary to be cruel?
That's such an interesting and important question because, and I'm kind of 2 minds. I think like I don't know that there is a humane version of detaining, right? And I'm always hesitant to say, my work is really, it's a lot about how horrific conditions in jails are. It's about how, how the ways that migrants suffer specifically in these local institutions. But what I don't want to suggest is that the solution is like the federal government could do it better, right? Like the federal government does this. They try all different models for immigration detention, and every model is cruel. Like, and I think that is both because holding people in captivity, warehousing people in this way is inherently cruel. But I also think immigration detention is cruel for a fairly specific reason, which is that by the 80s, as I mentioned, one of the main groups that are being detained are asylum seekers, particularly from Haiti, particularly from the Caribbean. And when Reagan is in his administration are talking about the possibility of expanding detention, the possibility of having mandatory detention for asylum seekers, one of the things they are so explicit about is that they see its power as a deterrent, right? They want to dissuade people from coming to the country, whether it is quote unquote illegally, whether it is as asylum seekers that the US, in the case of Haitians, doesn't think are legitimate, right? Doesn't think are real political refugees. So I think that part of the work of detention, right, is that it is supposed to be this image, this sort of symbol that if you come in the way that is not, one of these incredibly narrow ways we've allowed you to come, you're going to suffer. You are going to be in this, you're going to suffer spiritually, emotionally, physically. And that this has been a really explicit intention behind this system. I don't think it has been particularly effective, but I think it is undeniable that that is kind of part of the logic of why it is as cruel as it is.
I wanted to,
Amber?
sorry,
Oh,
Amber,
go
really
ahead.
quick. I wanted to get Matt's question just because it builds on that one. And then I also just wanted to give our group a heads up that as we get close to the top of the hour, we're going to want to let Dr. Nofil go. But I'll toss to Amber in just a second. The question from Matt is related, I think, to Stan's question, so it may have been partly addressed, specifically asking about the terrorist deportation, Lake and Riley Acts. Are these more performative than actual immigration enforcement? And so I think that sort of performative cruelty you touched on a little bit. That sort of, and then we had news cameras accompanying these really brutal ICE raids as well. So there's a point. They're not trying to be the sort of pinnacle of modern incarceration, but rather a sort of bruiser, warrior kind of force. So I think you touched on that a little bit, but I just wanted to note that. And then Danny Duary shared also a link to, the link was not working. Thank you for letting me know, Danny. I'm going to, and he said thanks for Danny in our Arab Studies program. I'm going to update that link, sorry. So I'll send a new link in just a second and toss to Amber. Sorry.
One thing I just was going to kind of piggyback off of with what you shared, Professor, was essentially the use of violence is a way to deter, right? Like as you were emphasizing, it's a way of kind of creating this vicarious learning experience for others to see if you're trying to do this, these are the consequences. And I think the impact of violence is not only physical, but especially mental and emotional, you know, and when we think about the generational consequence, it's horrible to know that we're going through such violence today and to see that it's perpetuated for centuries and essentially where it's gotten us and where it might take us, you know. But thank you so much for your share.
Yeah, no, to your point, I think that is the question of sort of psychological violence is one that I think is just undeniable in kind of the archives of this topic. And I think, I've reflected a lot on that. And I think part of it's just inherent to incarceration. But I think there is something about, part of what I think is so torturous about immigration detention is that you are not serving a sentence, right? There is no exact end to your time here. You often have no idea what is going on with your immigration case, right? If you are in one of these rural places, many of these folks say, I haven't actually seen an immigration official in like 6 months. I don't know if anyone even remembers I'm here. So like, I think there's really a feeling of like, you could disappear in this system. Like who is looking out for you? Whose radar are you on? And it is something that just people say again and again, right? That it is often not the physical violence, it is like the monotony of this experience, and it is just this sort of this torture of not knowing, having no, this could be a couple days of incarceration, this could be a year of incarceration. And that is, that I think also has a political purpose, right? If you were trying to get people to give up, if you want people to abandon their claims for asylum, if you want people to say it's not worth it to stay here, this isn't what I thought of the United States would be like, right? Like this has a really powerful deterrent effect in that way as well.
Thank you so much for coming and bringing such a powerful book and so much information. We sure appreciate it. And hopefully another book and another visit.
Yeah, we'll see. Definitely another visit, another book.
Okay.
But thank you so much for having me. It's been so lovely to chat with you all. And
I just very quick point that Vanessa Ramirez had her hand up. Vanessa, if you'd like to quickly type a question, and also if it was about the books, Vanessa, I will put my email one more time. Sorry with a point of order as we were wrapping up, everybody. But thank you for joining, Vanessa. And there's my email address for a copy of the book. Sorry, I interrupted the nice wrap up. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you so much, Dr. Nofil.
Thank you again for coming. We really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Conversations on Race and Policing has been supported by funding from the California State University San Bernardino College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, Pfau Library, and the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. Finn Lee is our technical consultant. Pamela Crossan provides administrative support, and Alan Yavor provides communication support. There's more information in the show notes, and please join us online at csusb.edu/CORP for upcoming programming and to find our catalog of over 100 past events with guests like Robin D.G. Kelly, Jamal Bowman, Dorothy Roberts, and many more.